Greetings of peace to all who've joined Mobilize Day 2. We've just had that wonderful visit to Pune, and of course, we all wish we could have been there in person. But this year, in many ways, has challenged a lot of what we've become accustomed to and asked us to rethink many things. And so we meet virtually. But I have no doubt that the panelists that are going to be in conversation with us for the session on dismantling racist practices in mobility will give you a lot to think about and bring so much of expertise. I'm going to use the opportunity because we have limited time for the session and because this year has been defined in many ways by the notion of breadth, whether it's COVID or whether it is having a knee on your neck and not being able to breathe, for us all to just consciously breathe together before I hand over to the panelists. So let's just breathe in. Now, we have esteemed panelists with long CVs, and I'm going to use the opportunity for them to tell you more about themselves rather than me reading their very accomplished CVs. And I'm going to kick off with Julian, who's joining us from Cambridge. Who's joining us from Cambridge, a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts. Julian, give us a little bit of a sense of who you are and where you first encountered injustice in your life.
Well, thanks, Rehana. Thanks, ITDP. Thanks, fellow panelists. Professor Julian Agyeman, Cambridge, Massachusetts, not Cambridge, England. That's a great question. Where did I first encounter injustice? I think as a kid growing up, you in an all-white school, I think it was the first time I was called names. I didn't realize I was any different until kids started calling me names at school. They didn't call me names for long because I was a big guy and they might have got hit if I'd have felt like it. But that was when, I realized I was different, when other kids started calling you names. And then you start thinking, well, why is that?
So, Paula, I'm going to move over to you. You're a doctoral candidate at the University of Oxford, but joining us from Madrid this morning or afternoon as it is in Madrid and Johannesburg. And you're studying transport studies, but your profile suggests a deep commitment to issues of social justice. Where did it all start for you, Paula?
Well, I'm originally a historian, so my background is in history. And I ended up in transport because of a moment of an epiphany in Bogota, Colombia, which is where I'm originally from, when I encountered a group of what most people would know as critical mass, or as we call it in Bogota, bici paseo. And it was very significant because everybody knows Bogota, or most of the people attending this event will know Bogota because of its relationship to progressive cycling policy and infrastructure. But having grown up there, I wasn't very close to that. It existed in close proximity to me, but I wasn't in touch with it. And so later in my life, as an adult, encountering this citizen initiative, that spoke about more than infrastructure and about more than policy, is that I arrived at transport as something that people, citizens, participate in, as something that is not entirely technical or something that doesn't require technical expertise, but actually something that we all live and embody and experience in remarkably different ways, depending on the kinds of bodies that we inhabit.
And we're going to pick up that discussion in a few minutes, Paula. But over to Daniel, joining us from the Research Center on Labor Relations and Inequalities. But Daniel, you're fortunate enough to be in the countryside of Sao Paulo, and also a firm commitment to fighting injustice and racism. Tell us a little bit about your first encounters, Daniel.
Well, Rehana, and first we'd like to thank for the invitation to participate in my fellow panelists. And I think my experience is very similar to that of Julian. I can remember in school being called names and how that was an epiphany for me that was different. And that difference was not valued as it should be. And Brazil has a historic background of silence regarding racial relations. It's a taboo. It's been a taboo for a long period, and now people are starting to wake up. And unfortunately, not by the thousands of killings of for Brazilian youth every year, but by George Floyd's case. And of course, it's important, but at the same time, we have several George Floyds every day in Brazil, and it's not even considered by our society in the way it discusses racial relations. So within the organization I work with, we are getting now we are studying more mobility, but it's been an issue for us in different ways since we were founded 30 years ago.
Thanks, Daniel, and wonderful to have you all so readily bring your personal experiences. But I know that many of you have written extensively, have researched extensively on these issues. And of course, for us in Johannesburg and in South Africa, because apartheid and racism was so much a part of our history, we always assumed that the mobility issues related to racism were just because of the broader structural issues around apartheid. But in hearing all of your introductions, I have a sense that even in places where discrimination is not on the statute books and not law, that racism, identity, and Paula, as you said, the right of bodies to move and access opportunity is not equal for everyone. And I'm keen to open up that conversation between yourselves in relation to, I guess, by virtue of the topic for this panel, we're not even arguing about whether there are racist practices in mobility. When we're saying dismantling racist practices in mobility, we're working from the presumption that it's there. So what are the things that need to happen to begin that dismantling process? Julian, shall we start with you?
Well, thank you. Yeah, let's take a step back from mobility. Mobility is a concept within urban planning. And as I've argued many times, urban planning, quite simply, is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy. And we can do something about it. And picking up on what Paula said, one of the problems I find with a lot of mobility discussions, transportation planning, it's all solutions oriented, and yet we need to excavate the problems, as Paula is saying. These are not simply physical problems in urban environments. Safety is not about building safer streets, important though that is. Safety is a much bigger concept, a socio-cultural concept, and it recognizes, again, as Paula said, that different bodies move differently and are either enabled or disabled from moving through public spaces, streets, parks, plazas. And so once we, I think, locate urban planning as a spatial toolkit for structural racism, then we can start thinking about mobility, not just in terms of how to move people around, but mobility justice, in recognizing that certain ways of transportation were deliberately put, for instance, freeways, were put through neighborhoods in Black American neighborhoods, literally to break up the neighborhoods. So transportation has been used as a very strong way of containing and repressing certain people. So once we understand that, then I think we need to adopt a mobility justice framework, recognizing that bike lanes are good, but we also need to think about traffic citations that disproportionately are visited on black and brown bodies, for instance, by the police. That's a reason why some people won't cycle, not just because there are not bike lanes. So I want my colleagues to, add their experiences to this, but I think we need to have this analysis of urban planning as a spatial toolkit for structural racism.
Thanks, Julian. So Paula, do we ever get beyond diagnosing the issues, knowing that they're about more than space, that they are about social and spatial justice? And what needs to actually happen, in your assessment, for us to dismantle these racist practices? And what is the experience of racism in the transport sector? What is that actually like? What do people feel like going through those issues?
Yeah, I think that question connects really well with what Julian was bringing up about moving towards a mobility justice framework and thinking about how certain forms of transportation have been historically oppressive of specific communities. Coming from Latin America, I think I bring what we would call a decolonial perspective, which sort of forces us to think outside of the city as the unit in which we're analyzing how racism is entrenched into transport and mobility. And I think that when we zoom out and we link these questions of social justice to broader issues, more global issues like environmental justice, then we start to see how, for example, automobility as a system is not just oppressive because of the kind of urban environments that it builds, but it's also oppressive because of the extractivist frontiers that are generated when we consider this big monolithic system for extracting oil and gas, which has obviously impoverished and ravaged indigenous communities and communities in, for example, the Nigerian Delta. And more recently, there's a lot of enthusiasm about electric cars and how they're going to be this great solution to problems of environmental perils in cities. But when we look at that in a broader scale, when we take that to the global level, then we see that there's still a site where profound injustices are being committed in transport. Because where do the lithium batteries that power electric cars come from? Well, they mostly come from the lithium reservoirs in northern Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, where a new extractivist frontier is displacing indigenous peoples and creating landscapes of desolation. So I think dismantling racist practices in mobility forces us to grapple with the ways in which racism is embedded into a world system and not just at the site of planning.
Thanks, Paula. Daniel, so a lot of your work, just picking up on what Paula's talking about, has been linked to this notion of inequality as it links to economy, that we're not just talking mobility, that we're talking a range of intersections between issues. And based on what Paula has just said, how do we tackle issues of dismantling racism in mobility, both at the micro local level, neighborhood level, all the way through to the global level? What's your experience been in relation to that?
Well, I think it's important to have an intersectional lens on this issue because, for example, if you're a woman, what's your right to the city? For example, when we think about gender-based violence, if you're a Black woman, that would change a lot. If you are a Black transgender woman in Brazil, for example, it has a lot to do with the situation. So we can think of the different systems of oppression one is subjected to. And when we think about our history in Latin America and Brazil specifically, we can think about this experience of the African diaspora, of being a Black person and thinking about slavery and mobility as a right to movement in terms of human dignity. But we can think about different types of state custody. And today we can discuss mass incarceration that is specifically connected to Black people and we don't have, because our bodies are political and symbolizes resistance, and we think about our bodies now in this discussion of mobility in terms of access to fundamental rights. And when we are discussing these communities in Brazil, especially the favelas, the Brazilian slums, nowadays with COVID and everything, these people are those who can't have the right to mobility itself, so as an intrinsic right, and also as an instrumental right to access other fundamental rights, for example, work, health, education. So there is this need to think about the city, and we are discussing a lot now in Brazil because of the upcoming elections, the municipal elections. We need to think about a city through the intersectional lens that can improve public policies to attend all these intersectionalities, all these different systems of oppression, if we want a city for everybody.
So I'm assuming, colleagues, that a lot of people who might be on the call are practitioners who work in cities or national departments in countries who are listening to what you are describing as deeply systemic, historic issues of injustice that are fairly global in nature, and are sitting there saying, well, actually, I'm not sure that this discussion has any relevance for my day-to-day activities as a practitioner in terms of trying to better space for people. And I can't fix these big systemic issues that Daniel, Paula, and Julian are talking about. Julian, if I'm sitting there having this thought right now, what's your advice to me about where do I practically start to impact what just feels like something too big for one institution, one city, one country to deal with on its own?
Well, of course, and it's a great question, and practitioners may be thinking, where do I even start? The first thing to do is to recognize the structure and structures in which you are working. And they're different in the UK or Spain or Brazil or the United States. But the overall structure, as described so well by Daniel and Paula, is there and it's real. So I would say to practitioners, look at your fellow practitioners, whether they are advocacy group members, whether they are planning professionals, transportation professionals. Do you represent the communities that you are serving? Because certainly one of the problems we have here in the US is that the people who are making decisions about transportation planning, urban planning more generally, do not look like the communities that they are serving. They are not representative of the communities. So are those people legitimate, trusted? Are they even effective at doing what they can do? So let me give you a concrete...
Julian, can I come in on that issue? Because often as we even change representativity in our cities and so forth, right? So people start looking more like the communities that we hope they would represent. But in fact, their values become more allied to the existing structure, and they feel the need to fit in. How does one keep true to your identity, your background, and begin to transform institution and space rather than being transformed by the norms and values of those institutions and spaces?
Well, one thing that I'm really excited about here in the US at the moment is a new generation of leadership, city leaders that are coming through. They are very much women of color. We have the opportunity in Boston to elect our first woman of color, who is talking about dismantling white supremacy, who is talking about food justice as racial justice, who has a Green New Deal for Boston. I think if we can get people reweaving the narrative of the city around these issues of mobility justice, of food justice, of climate justice, of Green New Deal, that provides an enabling framework so that these people who are feeling jaded and feeling that, you know, that they can't change things, if the structures can be changed by this new generation of leadership that I see, then that's a good thing. And I am you know, very hopeful that we're going to see more of this in US cities, and it's something again that I think will reap change. So, for instance, we have an organization in Boston called the Boston Planning and Development Authority. It's still about development rather than planning for communities. The proposed changes that hopefully Councillor and then Mayor Wu will bring in will be changes that change the construction of that organization. So, you know, we need leadership, I think, to start to change, start to dismantle these structures.
Paula, thanks, Julian. Your assessment of what's required to fundamentally transform institution and space, and I know that you feel very passionately about identity and the ability to move and the right to the city. Your sense of what needs to happen?
I think in Latin America, there's this great tendency that you observe throughout the continent towards great centralization. So it's usually the conversations are held at the site of capital cities, and they're at the cost of great disinvestment and disinterest in smaller urban areas, or what we'd call the periphery. And I think a big step forward would be for planners to actually turn to these other regions that exist in all of our territories and seeing what kinds of practices are flourishing there. And also,
so Paula, are you able to give us some specific examples of what you're talking about? Because I think I'm also one of those people who's guilty, even in the South African context, of a focus on kind of big metropolitan municipalities and the challenges of urbanization and so on and so forth. So are you able to give us some examples that could be inspiring?
So, I mean, I think there's just such great opportunity for learning when tapping into cities that haven't been, swallowed by the urban impetus, so to speak, where people continue to exercise different kinds of mobilities. And so, for example, in Colombia, it's remarkable. You see a lot of attention paid to Bogota. You see a lot of attention and a lot of excitement around Medellin and all of these great narratives of urban transformation. But you also have like lesser known areas where people cycle a lot. And so near Bogota is a region called Boyacá, which is where our great sporting cyclists come from. And a lot of smaller, lesser known cities where these kinds of mobility practices continue to flourish, and that I believe are at risk of disappearing if they are not fostered and if they're not paid attention to. But I also think we have a great challenge and is coming to terms with our racism in Latin America. You always have this discourse that in Latin America, we're not racist. We just have, class bias, because race and class just map onto each other so very exactly. And I think dismantling this myth that we're a mixed society, or acknowledging the violence of that mixing, and dismantling this idea that race doesn't exist, would be a necessary step. And so targeting communities and developing projects that directly target, indigenous migrants into cities, for example, or there's now a big wave of migration of people from the Caribbean, from Venezuela, with different racial backgrounds that I think would be important to pay attention to when planning transportation projects, because we're obviously seeing a great demographic change that needs to be attended to. I don't think this myth holds up any longer. So coming to terms with that, I think, is a necessary step. It might be difficult for planners, as you say, but it's a little bit similar to the discussion we often have about women, right? So you have a lot of transport planners staging all male panels, and then they come and they say, well, we don't know any women who could come and speak. Well, you actually have to actively seek out women and people different from you to come and speak, and to give them a meaningful space a meaningful role in these spaces, and not just a symbolic sort of like wallflower role in the spaces you're creating.
So Daniel, just as Paula transitions us to the issue of representativity and voice, and not the tokenism of it all, you also work fairly actively with children. And often when we think mobility, we tend to focus on kind of young, active, 30 or 20 to 50-year-olds. And I think that Pune video that we watched earlier in the opening today is just an indication of who needs to move. Your sense from the work you've been doing, Daniel, around the complexity of race and identity as it comes forth in the mobility discussion. So even where supposedly everyone feels like they come from a similar racial background, but there's still racism. Is that how it is, or am I misunderstanding?
Oh, and I think it's important to bring this issue of children, because in many of Latin American countries also we have this idea of minor versus the idea of a child, which is different actually, not only because of the legislation, but because the idea of minor is the idea of being against the law. And this is the image we have, for example, for Black children as always against the law. And when we think about their participation in the debates and take into consideration, there is a lot of violations of their rights to participate, to belong to the city, because they are not seen as a person that votes, So that's the problem in this discussion. So we need to acknowledge the fundamental rights of children also to belong, to have access to human rights, and think about the city as the space for a full existence. As a geographer, a very important Afro-Brazilian intellectual, Milton Santos, always says, when we think about the space in the context of globalization, he always stressed the idea of the city as this space where we can build different ways, not that of the hegemonic thinking, the way our planners usually think. And we can think ourselves as planners as well. We have different experiences of participatory budget in some Brazilian cities like Porto Alegre, even as Santo André, that is in the São Paulo metropolitan area, where we can discuss more horizontally, in a more horizontal way, these issues. And I think, as Paula mentioned, we have a centralization idea of countries and politics. So we need to have more attention to the city as this space where we can develop new ideas for urban planning, especially for those who, for whom the project is not to have urban planning. I was mentioning the favelas, and sometimes there is a misunderstanding that the project's bad, the project is not accomplishing the objectives, but indeed, this is the project. So if we see ourselves as the planners as well, and in budget, as I said, in participatory budget and other experience, but from the civil society organizations, then we can start to move forward in the city level.
I think there's a really interesting point that Daniel's making, and I mean the phrase I use is co-production. I'd like to see much greater co-production in terms of public space. Now, think about an urban park. It needs to be designed, it needs to be managed, and it needs to be programmed. Imagine the progressive parks department that says, we're going to co-produce this with the community. Similarly, a transportation plan. we're going to co-produce this with the community. And mobility justice would say that all of these different identities move through space differently. If we had a co-produced transportation plan, a mobility plan based around the mobility justice paradigm, we would have a very different transportation system. And I think it comes down to one of the dangers I see in a lot of transportation planning is it's about what can our city become, rather than thinking about who gets to belong in the city. And we are increasingly denying belonging, whether it's people who are homeless or underhoused, whether it's people who are refugees from gentrification of our cities. And one of the problems that we have now is that we're really building cities for people to invest in rather than to live in. And that's a very big danger. And gentrification, certainly in the United States, is really changing the focus of cities. But getting back to this idea of co-production, it's got to be something that we can do across cultural groups. And it's got to be something that recognizes very different identities. And if we can do that, then we can...
So Julian, and I'm just going to put this bluntly because we are in a conversation about race and racism, right? So if I'm a white practitioner in anywhere across the world who's been schooled in a particular way of thinking, who's now listening to this conversation, who's been reading actively about issues of transformation, and I really want to do things differently. And you're talking co-production, but I, of course, can't change the color of my skin, or I can't change my gender. When I arrive at public participation, I am who I am. Is that an automatic disadvantage for me? And what's your advice to people who want to get into co-production, public participation in meaningful ways, but there are parts of their identity that they can't leave behind when they step into a room?
It's a great question. I'm teaching a class at the moment on food justice in policy and planning. And 75% of the class are white, and they are asking that exact question. How do I become of service in a movement, the food justice movement, which is predicated on decentering white supremacy? You can move from being an ally to being an accomplice. Not just putting Black Lives Matter signs on your lawn, but actually joining in protests, listening, finding out what these differences and expressions of the need for recognition are. White practitioners can be these accomplices. This is not to disqualify you, but it is to say, please recognize that you come from a culture, a settler colonial culture in the United States that has created the situation that we have now. You can be part of dismantling it, but you have to take your lead from those who are most harmed by the system. And this is, I think, one of the principles that we should employ in thinking about co-production. Co-production allows people to belong. It makes them feel that they have meaning. It requires great bravery in the sense of releasing some power by government authorities. But there have been good examples of co-production on a minor scale. But let's think about the ways that we can do it on a larger scale. Daniel mentioned participatory budgeting. What is that? That's co-production. That's co-producing a budget based on a recognition of difference and diversity of views within the community.
So Paula, please go ahead. Go ahead. It's fine.
I just wanted to take cue from what Julian and Daniel were saying, because I think it relates to something that I am quite concerned about, and it's the idea of redistributing expertise. So you asked Julian this question, what do I do if I'm a white, cisgendered male planner coming in to intervene in a community? And I think it's fundamental, as I mentioned in my introduction, that we start thinking about what we value as expert knowledge in transport planning. And obviously, transportation has historically been a very heavy discipline, very engineering and very male-dominated. So I think it's important to take cue from what different kinds of communities are doing around transport and consider, where do people gain knowledge about transport? In what ways is it legitimate? And consider that legitimacy and knowledge is not limited to having a university degree or X many years of transport planning experience, but also from the everyday lived and embodied experience of being on the move in an urban space. And in that respect, I think, or in my own research, I have found a great wealth of grassroots initiatives of people, taking charge of mobility and creating spaces for thinking about mobility otherwise. Regrettably, more often than not, the authorities don't heed to these calls for thinking about planning and for transport planning and mobility differently, but they nevertheless exist. And I think a fundamental aspect of thinking about the right to the city and the right to mobility is to tease out and excavate where already people are putting into action practices and initiatives that directly illuminate what a right to the city might look like. So to give you an example, about 2 years ago when I was in Chile, I participated in a family and inclusive community cycle ride. Critical mass rides can be very exclusionary spaces. And I say that because something that drew my attention about this space was how they incorporated tandem bicycles to bring along people with sight disability, so they could also participate. How the route was designed to be short so that children could participate. How they brought in a little, train so that the elderly could participate. So spaces like that actually are territorialized and grounded in territorial experiences of mobility and communities' needs above else, rather than planners' imaginaries.
So Paula, the question I was going to ask you as we came in was just the issue around gender. And I think, as the Me Too movement has unfolded, and certainly in South Africa, gender-based violence, even during COVID, has absolutely been on the rise and more intensified. What are the issues that you think male transport planners need to be sensitive to when approaching issues of gender?
Oh, God. I think one of the key things that has been highlighted, especially over the past year, because with the pandemic, suddenly this idea of care and the importance of care for keeping our communities going, it has taken the center stage. And this idea of women being the people who do loves labor really maps onto concerns with transportation, and feminist urbanists and feminists who work in transportation have highlighted how women move differently because of this gender division of labor. So the point they're trying to make is, we have historically been allocated the space of the home and the activities of care, such as taking children to school, taking the elderly to their medical appointments, running all kinds of errands to keep the household going. And this entails that our movements are not pendular in the way that men's movements are from the house to the workplace, but multi-sided, and how transportation systems have not been designed for those movements to be safe, efficient, cheap, fundamentally, and the need that exists for planners to take into account how women move differently and sort of dislocate this universal white male subject of transportation planning to consider a broader array of mobilities.
So Daniel, we haven't really covered in this discussion the economy of mobility and the cost and the implications around that for poverty and inequality. So we have a couple of minutes remaining. Can I allow you to come in on that issue?
Sure. CERT, the organization I work with, has been conducting research on the access to work of employees of different economic sectors. And we found out that for Black people in metropolitan areas like São Paulo is significantly different. The time that they need in terms of mobility to access work. So the majority of the white workers, they use their own vehicle to go to work, whereas the Black population use it's 75%. For example, in the sector of the law firms, and you have the lawyers, but you have also the administrative personnel, and they use the public transportation, and they spend 2 hours, 3 hours. And when we think about access, this is the issue we need to discuss in terms of structural racism. And for example, even to find a job, there is a research carried out by IPEA, which is the official research institute in Brazil, that shows that if you are in the predominantly white neighborhoods, you have 9 times more chance to find a job within a time, a walking time of 30 minutes in comparison to the periphery areas, the border zones of the cities, as Paula mentioned before. So it's the same, for example, with the right to life, because the life expectancy, you get killed. For example, in the Cidade Tiradentes, which is the predominantly black district in São Paulo, you have a 57 years old life expectancy line, whereas in the most white neighborhoods in São Paulo, which is Moema, it's 80 years old, the average death age. So what does that mean in terms of access to health, education, work, as we were talking about? And this is an issue that we've been discussing more in Brazil. Fortunately, after George Floyd's death, things are beginning to change in terms of discussion. I hope this is the legacy we can have in Brazil, the debate, because as I said before, it used to be a taboo, in terms of public policies, but also different issues such as the economy in big cities like São Paulo.
Thanks, Daniel. So talking about time and time limitations and time use as a poverty indicator, unfortunately, that precious commodity is not necessarily working with us, but I think we've managed to cover a lot of ground. And in a few minutes, we will be opening for questions that might be raised by the audience that want to be put to any one of you. So whilst we're doing that, Julian, parting thought, parting shot before we close our conversation?
Yeah, let's shift the mobility discussion to mobility justice. Let's shift the focus from physical infrastructure to socio-cultural infrastructures, the way different people get to move, what are the barriers to their movement. Let's think about how we could co-produce mobility just futures.
Thanks, Julian. Paula, from you?
I think I just want to bring an example that I think brings together many of the things that have been discussed here. And it's the case of domestic workers, who are the women who do loves labor for the women who can afford to pay someone else to do that. And more often than not, in Latin America, these women are racialized women, either Black or indigenous descendant women, who tend to live in the more peripheral areas of cities and who have to undergo hours and hours in public transportation to get to their workplaces. Often after having had to take care of their own families back in the house and working under extremely precarious conditions. In the case of Colombia, a lot of women who work in the domestic labor sector are women who have been internally displaced due to the internal conflict. So I think it's a really interesting example that really pushes us to think about how different vulnerabilities intersect and how they come together at the site of movement, at the site of mobility. So displacement, racialization, the kind of labor you have to do, the kind of movement that labor requires you to undertake, and also how underserved the places where they live are in terms of transportation and connectivity. Because it's not, it seems preposterous to me that one should sit in a bus for 2 or 3 hours to get to the other side of the city to continue to do love's labor for someone else.
Powerful words. Thanks, Paula. Daniel, closing thoughts, parting shots?
I think we have to acknowledge that when we are discussing dismantling racism, we're not talking about a specific issue that is separated. That's why I'm very happy we're discussing that in the plenary, because we're talking about an idea of development, of exercising human rights, and basically an idea of society from this perspective of dismantling racism, and that's the case for mobility. So I think we need to have that in perspective, because this is the dimension of this discussion. Thank you.
So let me take the opportunity to really thank all of our panelists. I know that there's never enough time when there's this much wisdom in the room to really be able to dig deep. But I think we've covered a lot. And I think the reminder that what we're dealing with is systemic, it's structural, it needs to be dismantled. And it's not just about mobility, racism, inequality, injustice, poverty, and the ability to create a society where people can, in fact, realize their potential without these structural obstacles that have been deliberately created to keep some out, needs to be addressed, and that it's going to need courage, it's going to need alliances, and that it's going to need the ability to have the tough conversations even when it feels uncomfortable. Julian, Paula, Daniel, thank you so much for your brilliant insights, your sharing of your individual stories, and your wisdom from the work you do, the research you've done. Christina, with that, I'll hand back to you.